When you think of an aristocrat in a fantasy story, do you imagine a Peter Baelish or a Robert Baratheon? Or maybe you think of Mercedes Lackey's Queen Selene of Valdemar. Perhaps you go darker and consider Abercrombie's Sandan Glokta, Denethor eating tomatoes while his son leads a doomed charge, or the Emperor rotting on his golden throne in Warhammer 40k. And the thing is, all of those are valid types of aristocrats, but they do exist on a spectrum, one might say. And today, in this first video of the series on fantasy courts and how to construct them, we're going to break down the 7 levels of aristocrats. Now, a few ground rules before we jump in. A duke isn't automatically higher than a baron on this list. We aren't just ranking these guys by their legal titles. Instead, we're looking at the political weight, the structural legitimacy, and the survival skill of these nobles. And we'll be pulling examples from everything from Lord of the Rings to Warhammer 40k, which, yes, I do consider part of the fantasy genre. And we'll also be looking at history, and we will see exactly who is doing what and how well they're doing it. Oh, and if you're watching this on your phone right now, go ahead and hit that hype button, or whatever the new feature is YouTube is testing out this week to appease the algorithm lords. Like, comment, subscribes, and welcome to another episode of Just in Time World Building with your host, Marie Mullaney. In level 1, we have the parasitic despots. You know them, you love to hate them. These are people like King Joffrey Baratheon of Game of Thrones, Commodus of the Roman Empire, or King John Lackland of England. These guys are dependent 100% on inheritance. They are destructive in nature and abusive in their personal relationships. They sit on their thrones like giant ticks and suck their kingdoms dry for their own prestige, pleasure, or ego. They're basically a wrecking ball, and when these types come to power and stay in power, you're generally assured that the kingdom, the empire, or whatever it is starting to wind downward as its legitimacy and strength fades. Now, all of these guys are terrible in a real-world situation. Commodus was a disaster for the Roman Empire, and John Lackland, well, in the long term, signing the Magna Carta was pretty good for Britain, but for England at that time, he was a disaster of a king. And that is because their focus is completely on themselves. They pay no attention to the broader strategic aims of their kingdom, and they basically treat the state as their personal property. But while that makes them disastrous in the real world, it makes them fantastic for telling a story or running a campaign in a fantasy world. Think of how many plot points erupt out of Joffrey's behavior. Joffrey's behavior ends Ned's life and creates the whole arc of Robb Stark and his drive toward King's Landing. Joffrey's behavior creates Sansa's arc and makes out of her someone who has rigid control over her emotions. It grows her up as a person and makes her capable of fulfilling a role as a strong political player. Joffrey's behavior causes Arya to run away, encounter the Faceless Man, and undergo her assassin's training, setting off her whole arc. Joffrey's behavior is central to Tywin and Tyrion's relationship, and that arc that spins off out of that. Joffrey's behavior is critical to every plot except, perhaps, Daenerys. She is just about the only character who is not directly affected by Joffrey's behavior, and whose plot does not kick off, intersect with, or get derailed by Joffrey's crazy. So, these guys are terrible rulers. You would never wish any of them on a country. But from a story perspective, they are gold. They might be level 1 politically, but they are storytelling masters. And when you are writing them, the key to remember is that they think only of themselves. They think of their own pleasure, their own bank account, their own desires. Everything else is secondary. They do not think of the wealth of their state, the prestige of their nation, or the welfare of their people. Even their family is irrelevant to them. Their goal in life is to maximize themselves. And honestly, other people don't really exist for them. If you write these nobles like that, they can be great generators of plot points, especially because their legitimacy rests on the legitimacy of your whole political system. It wasn't possible to just remove Commodus. He was the Roman emperor. If you remove him, you undermine the legitimacy of the state. In the same way, it wasn't possible to just remove Joffrey. If you depose him or kill him, and it's found out, you undermine the legitimacy of the kingdom. And this was especially relevant in the Seven Kingdoms because they had just been through a rebellion. If they now did a coup or another rebellion or something like that, you create fundamental instability and start opening the potential to a revolving door of kings, which helps no one and certainly not the family of the despot. And in fact, that's what happened after Commodus had that unfortunate incident. His reign was followed by the aptly named Year of 5 Emperors, which was exactly as chaotic as you could imagine. So, if you want to use one of these parasitic despots to maximum effect, set up a situation where it's hard to just remove them, where there are political safeguards preventing them from being easily ousted. Then it becomes a juggling act for everyone else. Do we keep this guy on the throne and try to contain him, which is the game that Tywin tried to play with Joffrey? Or do we actually figure out a way to remove him and manage the consequences, which is the game Lady Olenna of Highgarden played? By the way, I did a video about creating characters like Olenna, which you can check out in the information card. And that's our level 1 parasitic despots and abusers. Let's move on to level 2. In level 2, we have the pillars of the state. These guys are the staple of what I call good guy fantasy. This is where you have people who possess deep systemic legitimacy, and they are, generally speaking, excellent at maximizing their kingdom's strength or their people's happiness and welfare. Their biggest skill is that they are fantastic at governing within the rules. Given the laws and setup of their world, they are good people who strive to maximize the well-being of the people around them. Great examples from fantasy include Queen Selene from Valdemar, who is a herald and is genuinely trying to make everyone in Valdemar as happy and safe as possible. From Game of Thrones, Ned Stark is a perfect example of this. He is completely legitimate within his bloodline and his ruling system, and he is trying to do what is best for his people as he sees it. And from Cashil's Dart, Queen Ysandra is a great example of a pillar of the state. People like this exist in the real world too. Marcus Aurelius, the Roman philosopher-emperor, was, as far as we can tell, a good man who genuinely tried to rule according to Stoic principles. Within the context of the political system of his time, he tried to maximize the welfare of his people as he saw it. And bear in mind, these guys aren't looking out for everybody in the entire world. They are looking out for the welfare of their people through their own cultural lens. But this strength is also their flaw. When they are faced with a situation that the rulebook doesn't have an answer for, or where the answer within the rules is a bad one that won't achieve happiness for their people, rulers like this struggle. To return to Valdemar, in the series Arrows of the Queen, Queen Selene's daughter Elspeth has fallen under a sway of a nanny. We'll talk more about the power of royal nannies later in this series. This nanny has basically been spoiling the kid, Elspeth, and actively breeding a fear of companions into the heir. Because of this, Selene has no good answers for what happens after her reign. How does the legitimacy of the kingdom continue if her heir is showing signs of being completely incapable of achieving the legitimacy? This presents a massive conundrum for Selene. Does she cut her own child out of the inheritance line and appoint someone else? What does she do, especially since she doesn't initially realize that the nurse is the root of the cause? That dilemma forms the core of Talia's journey as the Queen's own herald in the first book. Talia needs to figure out that it's the nurse, Hilda, who is poisoning Elspeth's mind, and Talia has to counter that influence to get Elspeth to the point where she can be chosen by a companion and thus achieve her legitimacy as heir. So, Just because these guys are straight shooters doesn't mean they have to be plot boring. You can absolutely use them in a story by manipulating that exact weakness, their desire to follow the rules of their country. That very dedication to good governance can be used as a flaw they have to overcome, forcing them to either work creatively within the rules, work to change the rules, or find some other way to adapt to the situation and drive the story forward. Now, while these pillars of state are great at running the country while the gears are greased, what happens if you have zero birthright, zero land, and the old money wants you dead? Let's talk about level 3, the tap dancers. In level 3, we have the people who have zero systemic legitimacy, but they take fake it till you make it to the absolute next level. Littlefinger from Game of Thrones is one of the best examples of this. Littlefinger is amazing. He was born to a minor, dirt-poor house on a rocky coastline called the Fingers. His family crest is literally a stone head. He claws his way up to become Lord Protector of the Vale through an absolutely wonderful streak of embezzlement, blackmail, political assassination, and marrying exactly who he has to marry. He becomes the master of coin down in King's Landing and orchestrates Ned Stark's betrayal. His whole setup is just insane tap dancing. He has almost nothing except his own wits, and he basically constructs a massive house of cards, knowing that it's either going to fall down on top of him, or he's going to use it to climb all the way to the top. Sandan Glokta from Joe Abercrombie's First Law is another great example here. He came back from the war as a broken, tortured prisoner, and he basically clawed his way to the top of the Inquisition through sheer bloody utility, applying his skills, manipulating people, and achieving great rank because he made himself indispensable. We have brilliant historical examples of these tap dancers too. Take Thomas Cromwell. He was a blacksmith's son from Putney who rose to become Henry VIII's chief minister, structurally dismantling the Catholic Church in England through legal tap dancing, before eventually losing his head. As I said, these guys play for keeps. They're either going to win big or they're going to end up dead in a ditch. There's no in between. Another great example of this is Piers Gaveston, who was just a Gascon knight's son. Because Edward II, and let's be honest now, the man was as gay as the day was long, and because he fell head over heels in love with Gaveston, Piers was able to manipulate Edward and stay on friendly enough terms with Queen Isabella to basically rule the kingdom. Of course, the other nobles of England didn't take too kindly to that, and Gaveston eventually had a fatal appointment with the executioner's block, courtesy of those angry barons. He was followed by Hugh Despenser, who is another perfect example of this setup. If you don't have the birthright for what you're doing, but you manage to manipulate, bribe, and politic your way into a position of absolute rule far beyond any legal legitimacy. The risk these guys always run is that because of that complete lack of legitimacy, no one is going to cry if you end up dead in a ditch. Unlike the parasitic despot who is protected by the systemic inertia of their crown, and unlike the good guy rulers who have deep legitimacy and the love of the people, the tap dancers have to protect themselves every single second. If the dance fails, they have no fallback. You slip up, you're dead, and the court just moves on. To survive, your network either needs to be so widespread that no one can safely take you out without destroying themselves, or you need to have sufficient personal military strength, or magical strength in the case of a fantasy world, to keep yourself continuously safe. And normally what happens is that they underestimate someone just once and end up in that ditch. Just before we leave our bottom feeders behind and move on to discuss the master manipulators, I have some exciting news. I've just launched the Kickstarter pre-launch page for my upcoming fantasy novel, Blood and Bloom in Las Vegas. Blood and Bloom is an urban fantasy mystery written in a gritty noir style featuring a druid protagonist. It actually won the Flash 500 novel opening competition, and it has all of the deep, intricate world-building elements you'd expect from the creator of this channel. That includes a fully realized magical economy where fairy dust is the base component. No fairy dust, no spells for you. And that means navigating the complex politics of keeping the local Bloomfay happy. The story also has deep mythological roots stretching all the way back to ancient Babylonian myths, and it actively draws on those myths and brings them into the modern world. If that sounds like the kind of story you'd like to read, follow the link down below and hit on the Notify Me button so that you get an email the second the Kickstarter goes live in July. Okay, back to the show. Next, we come to the powerhouses of machinations and political fantasy, the master manipulators. Now, these guys are different from your tap dancers in one crucial way. They have legitimacy. They aren't just building a fragile house of cards to claw their way to the top. They aren't wholly dependent on somebody else the way Gaveston was on Edward II or the way Littlefinger was on the Baratheon kings and the Lady of the Eyrie. They have their own structural power base, but they are also cunning, manipulative, and incredibly strong in their own right. We have an amazing historical example in the shape of Cardinal Richelieu of the Three Musketeers fame. Now, Cardinal Richelieu gets a very bad reputation in Alexandre Dumas' stories, but in point of fact, the Cardinal was actually quite good for France. He successfully checked the power of the global Habsburg dynasty, and he worked tirelessly to ensure French dominion in the 30 Years' War, even to the point of allying with Protestant nations, despite having ruthlessly suppressed the domestic Huguenot rebellions of the 1620s. He was also an alumnus of the University of Paris and the headmaster of the College of Sorbonne, renovating and extending the institutions, and he became famous for his patronage of the arts, founding the Académie Française, the learned society responsible for maintaining the French language to this day. So, he genuinely wasn't as horrifying as Dumas made him out to be. Instead, he was a master manipulator, using his inherent legitimacy as a cardinal, combined with his direct access to the French king, to forge a centralized state that worked for his vision of France. And that's important when creating a master manipulator, because unlike the parasitic despot, these guys aren't solely focused on themselves. They are focused on the state. Yes, they personally benefit, but the state benefits a great deal from their competence as well. Another incredible historical example comes from Sweden. Count Axel Oxenstierna. He became the High Counselor to King Gustavus Adolphus when the king took the throne at the age of just 17. Axel was about 10 years older than Gustav, and the two became close friends, launching sweeping military and administrative reforms that turned Sweden into a global superpower. After Gustavus Adolphus fell in the Battle of Lutzen in 1632, Axel took the lead in the war. He became the practical ruler of Sweden, stabilizing a weak wartime economy while maintaining a complex balancing act alliance with both the German Protestants and Catholic France. Axel was one of those brilliant minds behind the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, which rewrote modern international diplomacy and solidified Sweden as a great power. And if you want a powerhouse example of a woman in this role, look no further than Eleanor of Aquitaine. Now, pop culture loves to paint medieval queens as passive victims or helpless bystanders, but Eleanor was a titan of structural power. She didn't have to tap dance for her position. She inherited the massive, wealthy Duchy of Aquitaine, making her the most eligible and powerful duchess in Europe. She became the Queen of France by marrying Louis, and when that marriage fell apart, she pivoted and married Henry, becoming the Queen of England. Eleanor was a master manipulator because she understood exactly how to wield that wealth and her geographic territory and her family ties like a grandmaster playing chess. When her relationship with Henry soured and he locked her away in prison for nearly 16 years, you might think her story was over. But the moment Henry died, Eleanor stepped right back into the light at the age of 67 and effectively took the reins of the Angevin Empire. While her favourite son, Richard the Lionheart, was off fighting the Third Crusade and subsequently getting himself captured and held for ransom in Germany, Eleanor ran the kingdom, managing the domestic administration, suppressing her younger son John's attempts to usurp the throne, and negotiating directly with European emperors and personally organizing the collection of ransom money to get Richard out of that jail. In her late 70s, she literally crossed the Pyrenees Mountains to arrange political marriages that would secure the future of her dynasty. But for all the legitimacy these nobles possess, they do have a systemic vulnerability. They are almost always dependent on their relationship with the monarch for the height of their power. When the relationship between the young Queen Christina of Sweden and the aging Axel weakened, she began political operations against them, and he was eventually forced to retire from the court. Notice again, though, the effect of legitimacy. He did not end up dead in a ditch. When Eleanor and Henry II fell out, he imprisoned her and she lost a great deal of influence. And that is the great weakness to exploit for drama and plot if you're using one of these nobles. Speaking of story, fantasy examples in this level of course include Tywin Lannister and Lady Olenna from Game of Thrones, but also Lord Vetinari from Terry Pratchett's Discworld. Vetinari is a master manipulator who operates on Ankh-Morpork's unique form of democracy. It's a one-man, one-vote system. Vetinari is the man and he has the vote. But honestly, he also plays Ankh-Morpork like a fiddle, manipulating thieves, nobles and commoners alike. Another great manipulator is Melisande from Cashield's Dart by Jacqueline Carey, who I also did a video about. So, these are figures who possess deep institutional legitimacy, but they are also absolute manipulators of the law. Where the weakness of the good guy level 2 rulers is that they often can't find a solution outside the strict rulebook, the master manipulators will stretch the law to its absolute breaking point and step into the shadows outside the law if they have to. They operate in that dark grey area of Machiavellian tactics. From a story perspective, the drama comes from their relationship with power. Because most master manipulators are attached to a crown rather than wearing it, Lord Vetinari and Louis XIV, the Sun King, being rare exceptions who consolidated both roles, their biggest weakness is that they are entirely dependent on keeping the royal relationship intact. Whether it's a relationship based on blood and intimidation like Tywin and Joffrey, or a relationship built on hard-won respect like Cardinal Richelieu and Louis XIII, it is a connection they have to put immense effort into maintaining. And as a writer, targeting that specific relationship is your key to telling great political stories. Okay, so far we've covered interesting but normal-ish types of nobles. Now, let's turn to the fantastical and speak about immortals. Look, writing immortals is hard, which is why I have done not one, not two, but 3 videos all about immortals, which you can check out in the links. But immortals make for some really interesting politics, as we can see with everything from Tolkien's elves to the vampire counts of Sylvania in Warhammer Fantasy, or the undead nobility of Carnath in the Eberron campaign setting. So, let's talk a little bit about why this specific form of politics is so fascinating. What immortals bring to the table is a temporal advantage that is just plain hard for mortals to counter. They have time. They can literally just sit on their backsides and wait for the pesky humans to die of old age. The downside of these guys, depending on whose perspective you're looking from, is that because of their immensely long lives, they tend to be completely distanced from their subjects. This is even more acute in the case of the undead, like the von Karsteins of Sylvania or the immortal vampire lords of Carnath, because the undead view their subjects as literal livestock. They look at the peasantry and think food. That, understandably, creates a very alienating effect at court. The positive side of having these long-lived nobles is that they have the unique ability to plan far into the future, way beyond the span of a single human life, and they have the temporal stability to actually guide that plan across centuries. Surprisingly, very few fantasy writers take advantage of this. Even Tolkien's elves don't really guide the world very well. They mostly just push back against Sauron's vision, which, don't get me wrong, that's good, and they try to preserve the past. However, we do have one brilliant implementation of a long-lived entity guiding a society, which actually comes from science fiction, specifically from Isaac Asimov's Foundation series. In the later books, it's revealed that the second foundation has been quietly, generationally, guiding the first foundation toward a specific macro-historical vision of the future. To my mind, that is one of the absolute best implementation of an immortal equivalent in politics. If you are going to include immortal elves or vampires as politicians in your world, this is what I want to see. I want them to have sweeping, long-range vision, because that actually capitalizes on the primary strength of being immortal. Neglecting that is, in my opinion, one of the biggest mistakes fantasy world builders make. The weakness of these hegemons, as I mentioned, is their emotional and cultural distance from their short-lived people. And from a storyteller's perspective, if you make their immortality and power absolute, it becomes very hard for them to interact with regular politics. They stop being characters and start acting as a MacGuffin plot device. Take Sauron, for example. Sauron does have a grand vision and he's driving towards a specific point. He wants to turn Middle-earth into his personally highly ordered playground. The immortal elves oppose him, but their viewpoint is fundamentally conservative. They don't have an equal positive vision for the future. They just want to maintain the status quo. Furthermore, Sauron is so powerful in his immortality that it is almost impossible to oppose him through standard political or military means without literal divine intervention. In the end, you need an epic quest where two hobbits drag a ring across a continent to dump it into a volcano. You have to destroy the MacGuffin item just to make the immortal king vulnerable. Now, that is fine, but bear in mind that the literal father of modern fantasy followed that exact plot. If you are going to write a story like that, you need to make sure that your implementation, your details, and your magic system feel fresh, so that you aren't just doing a straight-up retelling of Lord of the Rings. So, use that core dynamic of immortal politics, the clashing of long-term visions, the frozen opposition between ancient powers, and the profound distancing effect between rulers and population. It's a great political weakness for characters, but it's an incredible narrative strength for you, the world builder. Now, that was a very fantastical look, and historically speaking, there aren't really human equivalents to true immortals. We could talk about Bronze Age rulers advertising themselves as god kings, but at the end of the day, they weren't immortal. There is, however, a perfect historical equivalent for our next level. Let's move on to level 6, Dynastic Founders. These guys make a massive sweeping impact on their region, their bloodline, and their kingdom. They are the founders of a new dynasty. They successfully take whatever legitimacy they had or did not have and create a brand new legitimacy out of it that they can pass on to their heirs. They are, generally speaking, rather different from our level 3 tap dancers. Tap dancers very rarely get to found dynasties. It does happen, but it's rare. It is much more likely that your dynastic founders are figures wielding massive military might, wielding terrifying magic, or otherwise bludgeoning and beating their various rivals into absolute submission in order to found their house. A great real-world example of this is William the Conqueror, who laid the groundwork for what would become the Plantagenet dynasty after conquering England in 1066 by defeating Harold Godwinson. That whole arrow through the eye situation. He created the whole institutional framework that spawned basically every English monarch until Queen Elizabeth I died without children, with, of course, a few breaks and civil wars in between. In a fantasy context, the perfect mirror to this is Aegon the Conqueror, who I am convinced George R. R. Martin based on William the Conqueror. Aegon Targaryen brought his dragons across the narrow sea, blew up the existing status quo of the separate kingdoms, and founded a brand new unified realm and dynasty after the fall of Valyria. Another good historical example operating in a slightly less brutal conquest vein is Charlemagne. He founded what would become the Holy Roman Empire, taking over from the old Merovingian kings. Now, technically, his grandfather, Charles the Hammer Martel, started the takeover, and Charlemagne's father, Pepin the Short, did a lot of the heavy lifting. But Charlemagne is the true dynastic founder who consolidated that power. He was absolutely viewed as the ultimate ancestral patriarch and had an entire mythos grew up around him, like the Song of Roland, which talks about his 12 paladins, and all of those other legendary tales. This is the archetype that gives you that profound father of our house, father of our nation vibe. From a storyteller's perspective, dynastic founders are fantastic because of their pure driving ambition. Either opposing them or working on their behalf can provide great character motivations. You can have a character who completely falls in love with the dynastic founder's grand vision, attaching themselves to that cause and driving forward with them into the future. Or you can have a character who is fundamentally opposed to them, fighting to protect the old ways from being crushed under the wheels of a new empire. One of the most interesting implementations I've seen of a dynastic foundation and renewal is in Catherine Kerr's Devery series. To understand it, you first have to know that the Devery books are a sprawling epic based on reincarnation, allowing you to explore the kingdom's history from its very first tribal founding all the way to its high Middle Ages. Somewhere in the middle of that history, the original royal dynasty falls apart because they run out of heirs. The realm collapses into 3 bitter warring factions, resulting in decades of brutal civil war and anarchy. To fix this, a master sorcerer named Nevane decides he is going to manufacture a one true king to park his backside on the throne and end the civil war, once and for all. Nevane finds a likely lad called Meryn with the right ancestral bloodlines, coaches the boy, and uses magic and political stagecraft to make the boy look incredibly impressive, making it appear as though Moraine is fundamentally destined by the gods to be king. Nevane guides the young king all the way through claiming his initial territory to the battlefield to overwhelm the other factions, gaining complete dominance and founding a unified new dynasty. It is a fascinating dynamic to read, blending an immortal mentor like Nevane with a dynastic founder who is actively being engineered into a living legend. There are so many incredible things you can play with in this noble archetype: destiny, war, propaganda, and the brutal logistics of how you actually found a new dynasty, make it stick, and pass it along to your children. And let me tell you, dynastic founders always have skeletons in their closet. No one rises that high without breaking a whole lot of eggs. You know what I'm saying? So even if you use the dynastic founder later in life, there is plenty of drama you can dig up about them. Now, you could easily say that these founders are our top-tier political players. After all, what could possibly be higher than founding a dynasty? Well, there is one final level left. And that, my friends, belongs to the weavers of mythology, the very rare individuals who leave their world fundamentally changed because of how they rise to power. Let's talk about myth weavers. These are exceptionally rare people, and they should be, because they have a truly fundamental paradigm-shifting effect on the world around them. Now, if you've been watching my channel for a while, you'll know that I am absolutely not a subscriber to the great man of history theory. The same applies here. If it hadn't been one of these specific individuals who made these massive sweeping changes, the socio-economic pressures of the era probably would have pushed somebody else into the gap to do it. But these figures still possess an elite, magnificently effective skill set, and they leave an enormous, undeniable impact on the world, and that does deserve acknowledgement. So, I'm not denying their impact, I'm just saying they are the product of their time, their environment, and the structural forces behind them. So who are we talking about when we talk about these myth weavers? Let's start in the real world, because yes, we do have historical people who wielded this kind of influence. The one I want to highlight first is Augustus Caesar, born Octavian, the first emperor of Rome and the adopted heir of Julius Caesar. Octavian was a political genius. He wasn't just smart and ruthlessly aware of how power worked. He also deeply understood his own weaknesses. He was not a battlefield commander. He was not a military strategist. And overcoming that deficit as a Roman leader is a pretty staggering feat, because their entire political legitimacy was built on martial prowess and military might. But Octavian overcame his limitation by securing the absolute loyalty and friendship of Marcus Agrippa. And Agrippa was a strategic genius and a phenomenal battlefield commander. Octavian's single greatest political coup was gaining Agrippa's friendship, keeping it, and completely trusting him. Trusting his general ensured that Octavian didn't need to take the field. He could let Agrippa run the military, while he focused entirely on the politics and the propaganda. And it worked. Octavian's second great skill was his ability to see which way the wind was blowing and guide the gale himself, making whatever ruthless, pragmatic deals he had to make. He despised Mark Antony, but he still formed a triumvirate with him and Lepidus to split up the Roman world, using that alliance until he was strong enough to destroy them. When he achieved absolute power, he acted ruthlessly to consolidate the empire, while keeping the common people on his side. He managed the narrative, found his military anchor in Agrippa, and fundamentally reshaped the Western world in a way that still echoes in our legal and political systems today. On the fantasy side, we can look at a few absolute titans. I promised you we'd talk about Warhammer 40k, so let's look at the God Emperor of mankind. Now, by the time most of us are playing in the current setting, he's a rotting corpse sitting on the golden throne, acting as a psychic lighthouse for humanity's warp travel. But leading up to that point, he had completely engineered the history of the human species. He rose to power, united a shattered Earth, drove humanity into the stars, launched the Great Crusades against alien threats, and fought a cosmic war against the ruinous powers of chaos. He is 100% locked into Mythweaver status. In epic fantasy, Rand al'Thor, the dragon reborn from Wheel of Time, certainly changed his world, and shows how these kind of characters can be used to create great stories if you follow him for 13 books? Or is it 15? Some huge amount of story. These characters and historical figures leave their world transformed by their presence, their politics, and their actions. When you're writing a level 7 political mythweaver, you aren't just writing a politician. You're writing a tectonic shift, someone who shatters the board and rewrites the rules for the next 1,000 years. And now, while the epic members of the channel scroll past, the incredible humans who changed my world by making these videos possible, let me talk about a few honorable mentions and how these levels can fluidly flow together. My biggest caveat to you in this whole video is this: don't get stuck thinking that a character must exist only in one single level forever. Rulers and courtiers are dynamic. For example, I really love the Cashel Legacy books by Jacqueline Carey, the whole Cashel's Dart series from beginning to end. In there, you have Vedre No Delaunay, who is a courtesan and a brilliant courtier. She exists somewhere in the grey area between these levels. She starts out with zero systemic legitimacy, essentially tap dancing to survive, before she is elevated to nobility. From there, she operates as a master manipulator, but she simultaneously possesses the exact heart and attitude of a pillar of the state, because she is constantly putting her life on the line to do what is right for the realm. She is essentially a master manipulator with a heart of gold. You could say she's a tap dancer who grows into a master manipulator but maintains the soul of a pillar of state. In Game of Thrones, you could make an argument that Peter Baelish is a master manipulator, though I personally prefer categorizing him as a pure tap dancer. Sansa Stark starts the story as a passive victim of a level 1 parasite, but she ends the story as a highly skilled manipulator in her own right. And my key takeaway for you is this: characters change, and indeed, to engage the reader, characters must change. In addition, it's important to remember that the context and perspective also matter immensely. In the real world and in fiction, a ruler might be celebrated as a just pillar of state by their own people because they are maximizing their realm's welfare. But to the neighboring kingdom they just invaded, they are viewed as a brutal, conquering destroyer. And I also want to emphasize that these levels aren't just for noble courts. You can adapt them to all sorts of forms of government. For example, I thoroughly enjoyed the Powder Mage trilogy by Brian McClellan, which offers a brilliant exploration of these dynamics outside of the aristocracy. You enter that story immediately after a French Revolution-style event. The politicians you meet are people who have actively engaged in overthrowing the monarchy. Field Marshal Tamas is a fascinating figure here, because he has the exact energy, drive, and impact of a level 6 dynastic founder, perhaps even a myth weaver, except he isn't actually founding a bloodline dynasty. He is founding a new republic born from revolution. He is a systemic founder, establishing a new framework of government, which makes him incredible to analyze. Surrounding Tamas, you have an entire ecosystem of other levels. You have Richard, the Union boss, who operates like a tap dancer, shading into a master manipulator. You have various other figures acting as puppet masters behind the scenes. I won't spoil the major plot twist, but that series is a great exploration of politics during a transitional era, watching a fantasy world pivot away from traditional nobility and toward early democracy. I highly recommend that trilogy to anyone who hasn't picked it up yet. And on that note, if you made it this far into the video, leave me a crown emoji down in the comments. If you want to see more from me on the messy mechanics of nobility, go ahead and check out my video on how to inherit a crown, and I will see you soon for another episode of Just in Time World Building.